Ethan Walker threw his last coin into the mud and didn't bother picking it up. He was done. Done with Montana. Done with sleeping in frozen barns and waking up to nothing. Done pretending that somewhere over the next ridge, the next territory, the next empty horizon, there was something worth riding toward. He had been moving for 11 years, and on that gray October morning in 1887, with his horse going lame beneath him and the wind cutting straight through his coat like it had a personal grudge, he finally admitted the truth. He wasn't riding toward anything. He was running from everything. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where broken people find their way back to something real, please subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that cold October morning. And the woman who changed everything. The horse's name was Soldier, and Soldier had carried Ethan Walker across more miles of American wilderness than either of them had any business surviving. He'd carried him through a Texas drought that killed half the cattle in 3 counties, through a Wyoming blizzard that buried men upright in their saddles, through a Colorado pass so narrow the rock walls scraped the stirrups raw, through 11 years of dust and distance, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a man who has stopped expecting anything good to happen. Soldier had never once quit on him. Until that morning. The lame step started just after sunrise, barely a hitch at first, the kind of thing a man tells himself he imagined. But Ethan had been riding long enough to know the difference between a horse moving carefully and a horse moving through pain. He pulled up and dismounted in the frozen grass at the side of the road, lifted Soldier's left foreleg, and found exactly what he'd feared. The shoe was gone. Not loose. Gone. And the hoof beneath it was already bruised and tender, the frog slightly cracked from the impact. "Well?" Ethan said out loud to nobody crouching there in the frost, with his horse's leg cradled across his knee. "That's about right." He straightened up and looked at the road ahead. Silver Creek was 4 miles north. The blacksmith there, a man named Holt, was the only one in the territory worth trusting with a horse like Soldier. Ethan had used him once before 3 years ago, passing through in the other direction. Holt had told him then that if he ever needed anything, the door was always open. He had not intended to need it. He had intended to be in Wyoming by nightfall. Ethan Walker had made a decision the night before, sitting alone in the back corner of a saloon outside Billings with a glass of whiskey he could barely afford and a letter from his brother in his coat pocket. The letter was 8 months old. It had caught up to him eventually, the way letters always did late, and full of things he could no longer do anything about. His brother's wife had died. The farm in Texas was gone. His brother had moved east and was, by his own words, starting over. Everyone, it seemed, was starting over somewhere. Everyone except Ethan, who wasn't starting or stopping or doing anything with any particular purpose. He was just moving. The way a river moves, not because it wants to go anywhere, but because water doesn't know how to stay still. He decided in that saloon, with the whiskey going warm in his hand, that Montana was finished for him. He would ride north, cross into Wyoming, and find work. Real work. Ranch work. The kind of work that paid in money, and not just in the lie that keeping moving meant you were going somewhere. That was the plan. The plan had lasted approximately 6 hours before Soldier lost his shoe on a frost-heaved stretch of road outside a property Ethan had never seen before. He looked at the gate. It was a plain wooden gate, solid and well-made, with a crossbar that looked recently replaced. The fence posts on either side were straight and properly spaced. A ranch road ran through the gate and curved away toward a cluster of buildings about a quarter-mile back from the road. A house, a barn. A few outbuildings, all of them looking like they'd been built by someone who took the work seriously. There was smoke coming from the house chimney. Ethan stood there for a moment, holding Soldier's reins, calculating. He needed to find out if there was a closer blacksmith than Holt in Silver Creek. He needed water for the horse. And he needed, if he was honest with himself, to sit down somewhere that wasn't the frozen ground beside a lame horse in the middle of nowhere. He pushed the gate open and walked up the ranch road, leading Soldier slow and easy. He hadn't gone 50 yards when the barn door opened and a woman walked out. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old. Somewhere in that particular stretch of a woman's life where she had stopped being a girl and become something harder to define. Capable, deliberate with an economy of movement that told you immediately she didn't waste much of anything. She wore a heavy canvas work coat, worn leather gloves, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that said she hadn't done it for appearance. She was carrying a bucket in one hand and a length of leather strap in the other, and she stopped when she saw him. She didn't flinch, didn't call out, didn't reach for anything. She just looked at him, the way a woman looks at something she's already assessed before she's had time to think about it. "You lost?" she asked, not unfriendly, not warm either, just direct. "No, ma'am," Ethan said. He stopped walking and kept Soldier calm beside him. "My horse threw a shoe about a half-mile south. I was hoping you might be able to tell me if there's a smith closer than Silver Creek." She set down the bucket and looked at Soldier. Not at Ethan. At the horse. She crossed the distance between them without hesitation, crouched and ran her hand down Soldier's foreleg. The horse, who did not normally tolerate strangers touching him without a period of introduction, stood perfectly still. She lifted the hoof and looked at it with the focus of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Bruised," she said. "Not bad. He needs a shoe and a day of rest before you push him hard." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why I'm looking for a smith." She stood up and looked at him directly. "There's no smith between here and Silver Creek. Holt's the only one within 20 miles of this road." Ethan nodded. He'd been afraid of that. "However," the woman said, pulling off her right glove, "I can shoe the horse myself." Ethan blinked. He wasn't a man who was easily surprised. Years of living rough had burned most of the surprise out of him, the same way weather burns color out of old wood. But he looked at her again, at the set of her shoulders, the steadiness of her eyes, and understood that she was not telling him something to impress him. She was telling him a fact. "You're a blacksmith," he said. "I'm a rancher," she said. "My father was a blacksmith. I can shoe a horse well enough to get yours to Silver Creek without doing more damage if you want." She paused. "Or you can walk him 4 miles in the cold and hope the hoof doesn't crack further. Your choice." Ethan Walker looked at his horse. He looked at the woman. He looked at the gate behind him and the road beyond it, and the particular nothing that waited for him out there. "I'd be grateful," he said. "Clara Bennett," she said, and extended her hand the way a man would, straight out, no ceremony. "Ethan Walker," he said, and shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, and then she turned and walked toward the barn. "Bring him in out of the cold." The barn was warm and clean, and organized in the way of someone who had learned the hard way that disorder costs time, and time is money. Clara had a small forge set up along the back wall, not the full operation of a professional smith, but sufficient bellows, a good anvil, a rack of tools hanging in a row by size, each of them clean. Ethan had worked with enough men in his life to know that a person's tools told you most of what you needed to know about them. He tied Soldier to the post she indicated and stood back while she built up the fire and began checking through her stock of shoes for the right size. "You ride through here often?" she asked without looking up from the shoe stock. "First time on this particular road," Ethan said. "I was heading north. To Silver Creek. Through it." She glanced up at that. Wyoming. That was the plan. She went back to the shoes. "Plans change," she said in the flat tone of someone who had learned that truth the thorough way. "They do," he agreed. She worked without talking for a while, and Ethan found himself watching her with the kind of attention he hadn't paid to another person in longer than he could remember. She knew what she was doing. Every movement had a purpose. She shaped the shoe with a confidence that told him she'd done this 100 times, heated it right, tested the fit against Soldier's hoof 3 times before she was satisfied, and set it with clean, even nails. She cleaned and trimmed the hoof as she worked, checked the other 3 shoes without being asked, and reset a loose nail on the right front that Ethan hadn't even noticed. The whole job took 40 minutes. "That'll hold," she said, straightening and stripping off her gloves. "He still needs the rest I mentioned. The bruising and the frog will give him trouble if you push him before tomorrow." "I understand," Ethan said. "What do I owe you?" She named a price that was fair lower than Holt would have charged, and the work was as good. Ethan paid without arguing and put his hat back on. He should have left then. He knew it. He could feel the moment where leaving was still simple, still clean, still the natural next thing. He took Soldier's reins and walked him back toward the barn door, and the cold air came in when he pushed it open, and the road was right there visible through the gate, exactly as empty as he'd left it. "You eat yet today?" Clara Bennett asked behind him. He stopped. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm making breakfast," she said. "Coffee's already on. You're welcome to sit if you want." Ethan Walker stood in the barn doorway for a moment that felt longer than it was. He almost said no. The word was right there, already forming itself. He'd said no like that 100 times to offers of a spare room, a hot meal, a chair by someone else's fire. Not out of pride, exactly. More out of the habit of not accepting things that made it harder to leave. "Thank you," he said instead. He didn't know why. The kitchen was warm and plainly furnished, a solid table, 4 mismatched chairs, a stove that was doing its job well, curtains on the single window that looked like they'd been made by someone who sewed well, but not for decoration. There was a framed photograph on the wall above the door. A man and woman on their wedding day. The woman was younger, but Ethan recognized Clara's posture, straight, composed, not quite smiling. The man beside her had a broad, easy grin, and the look of someone who was always just about to go somewhere. Clara poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and set it in front of him, without asking how he took it. He drank it black. She seemed to have assumed correctly. "How long have you been ranching alone?" he asked. She didn't pause, but there was a slight adjustment in the air before she answered. 2 years, she said. "My husband died in the spring of '85. My father 4 months later." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, because there was nothing else to say. "So was I," she said straightforwardly, cracking eggs into the pan. "For a while I wasn't sure I could manage it. The ranch, I mean. There was a man in town who offered to buy the property. Offered twice. I told him no both times." "Why?" She turned from the stove and looked at him. "Because my father built this ranch, and my husband is buried on this land, and if I'd sold it, I'd have been left with nothing to show for any of it." She turned back to the stove. "So I learned what I needed to learn, and I kept it." Ethan drank his coffee and said nothing for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the frost was burning off in patches where the morning sun had started working its way through the cloud cover. "You learned smithing after he died?" he asked. "I knew the basics from watching my father," she said. "But I practiced. Bought a hammer, made mistakes, ruined a few shoes. I'm not Holt, but I'm good enough." Good enough, Ethan thought. There was a whole philosophy in that phrase, the way she said it. Not false modesty, not bragging, just an accurate accounting of where a person stood and what they could do from there. He'd met a lot of people in 11 years of moving. Men who talked big and delivered small. Men who talked small and delivered nothing. Very few people he'd met had Clara Bennett's particular quality, which was that she seemed to understand exactly what she was and what she wasn't, and had decided that was sufficient. She set a plate in front of him. Egg salt pork, half a corn biscuit, simple, good, hot. "You do this often?" he asked. "Feed strangers?" "No," she said, sitting down across from him with her own plate. "Most strangers don't stop here. Most people ride straight through to Silver Creek or past it." "Lucky horse," Ethan said. She almost smiled. Not quite. They ate without talking for a few minutes, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually were for Ethan, who had spent most of his adult life moving through other people's spaces and always feeling the slight friction of being somewhere he wasn't supposed to be for too long. This silence was different. It had a quality of ease to it that he couldn't explain and didn't try to. "Where were you before Montana?" Clara asked. "Colorado before that, Wyoming before that, Kansas for a while, Texas originally." "Texas," she said. "What part?" "Panhandle country. My family had a cattle spread, smaller than this one." He picked up the biscuit. "My father died when I was 19. The drought took most of what was left. I rode north and kept going. And you never went back. Nothing to go back to, he said. It came out matter-of-fact the way it always did, because he'd been saying it for long enough that it had stopped feeling like anything. Clara looked at him steadily. That's a long time to be without a place, she said. It was not said with pity. It was said the way a doctor might observe that a wound had been left untreated for too long, as a simple statement of observable fact without judgment and without softening. Ethan found he didn't have a response to it. He finished his breakfast. He thanked her for the food and the work. He walked back to the barn, checked Soldier's new shoe one more time, decided the horse was still moving too careful to push north that day, and made a decision that he told himself was purely practical. He walked back to the house and knocked on the door. Clara opened it. "Is there a place in Silver Creek where I can put up for a night?" he asked. "I want to let him rest properly before I ride hard." "There's a boarding house on the main street," she said. "Mrs. Hale runs it. Decent room, decent food, not expensive." "Thank you," he said, and put his hat on. "I appreciate what you did today, Mrs. Bennett." "Clara," she said. "Clara," he said. He led Soldier down the ranch road and through the gate and turned north on the road toward Silver Creek, moving at a walk to spare the horse. Behind him, the gate swung shut in the wind. He told himself he was done there. The stop was over. He'd paid his bill, eaten his breakfast, and had a fine story to tell about a widow woman who could shoe a horse better than most men he'd hired. He told himself that. He walked Soldier into Silver Creek and found the boarding house and paid Mrs. Hale for a room and a stall for the horse. He ate dinner at the small restaurant beside the dry goods store. He walked the length of the main street once, which didn't take long because Silver Creek was not a large town. Maybe 200 people, a school, a church, a saloon, the blacksmith shop, a land office, a general store, and the kind of quiet that settles on a place that has survived long enough to stop being surprised by things. The stableman, a round, cheerful fellow named Pete Garner, had hurt his back 2 weeks earlier, lifting a wagon axle, and was managing alone with visible difficulty. He mentioned this 3 times in the course of settling Soldier in for the night. He mentioned additionally that he had work backed up horses, waiting customers getting impatient. Ethan told him he'd give him a hand in the morning. He didn't know why he said that either. He lay in the boarding house bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and tried to reconstruct the logic of his day. He had stopped because of a horseshoe. He had stayed because of a bruised hoof. He had eaten breakfast with a woman he'd never met, and was spending the night in a town he had no reason to be in, and in the morning he was going to help an injured stranger with his horses, before continuing north toward Wyoming and whatever thin plan he'd assembled for his life there. All of that was explainable. What was less explainable was the feeling he'd had sitting at Clara Bennett's table, in the silence after breakfast, with the coffee warming his hands, and the frost burning off outside the window. It was a feeling he recognized distantly, the way you recognize a song you heard once in childhood. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to know that you knew it once. He hadn't felt it in 11 years. He stared at the ceiling of Mrs. Hale's boarding house and tried to name it. He couldn't. His vocabulary for certain kinds of feelings had rusted shut from disuse. He turned on his side and closed his eyes and told himself he'd be in Wyoming within the week. He believed it too. He genuinely did. He was in Wyoming within the week. That was what he'd told himself. But Monday morning came, and Pete Garner could barely lift a saddle, and there were 3 horses waiting that needed attention, and Ethan had said he'd help, so he helped. And Monday became Tuesday, because one of those horses threw a fever overnight and needed watching. And Tuesday became Wednesday, because Pete's wife came by the stable in tears, saying the doctor had told her husband he needed 2 more weeks off that back or risk permanent damage. And she looked at Ethan with the exhausted eyes of a woman who had already asked for help from everyone she could think of and was running out of names. "I'll stay through the week," Ethan said. He didn't mean for it to mean anything. It was just a practical decision. Pete needed help. Ethan needed to let Soldier rest properly anyway. The boarding house was affordable. There was no urgent reason to push north before he was ready. That was the logic. It was perfectly sound logic. What the logic did not account for was Clara Bennett. She came into town on Wednesday afternoon for supplies, and Ethan saw her from across the street while he was outside the stable, checking a mare's hind shoe. He saw her before she saw him, saw her move through the street with that same purposeful economy he'd noticed the first morning, stopping at the dry goods store, exchanging a few words with a woman outside the post office, not lingering anywhere longer than necessary. He told himself he was not going to cross the street. He crossed the street. "Mrs. Bennet," he said. She turned and looked at him with mild, genuine surprise. "Mr. Walker, I thought you'd be in Wyoming by now." "Pete Garner hurt his back," he said. "I'm helping out at the stable for the week." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the distinct feeling she was deciding whether or not to say something. She decided to say it. Funny thing for a man passing through to do. "He needed the help," Ethan said. "A lot of people need help," she said. "Not many strangers stop to give it." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he said nothing. She shifted her basket from one arm to the other and looked at him with those steady eyes that had the unsettling quality of seeing things she hadn't been told. "Come by the ranch on Saturday if you have time," she said. "I've got a fence section on the north pasture that's about to give out. I could use another pair of hands for a few hours. I'll come by," he said. She nodded and walked on toward the dry goods store, and Ethan stood in the middle of Silver Creek's main street, feeling like a man who had just agreed to something considerably larger than fence repair without being able to say exactly why. He went back to the stable and worked the rest of the afternoon and didn't think about it. Or tried not to. He was not particularly successful. Saturday came. He rode Soldier out to the Bennett Ranch after breakfast, and Clara had coffee ready and the tools already out, and they went to work on the fence, without much preamble. She knew what she was doing. She knew which posts needed full replacement versus resetting, which rails were salvageable, and which ones weren't, how to tension the wire properly, so it would hold through winter. She worked alongside him without giving unnecessary instruction, which Ethan appreciated, because he'd spent years being talked at by men who knew half what they thought they did. "You always do your own fencing?" he asked, driving a new post into the frozen ground. "When I can," she said. "I hire help for the big jobs branding roundup. The rest I manage." "The rest being everything." "Most of it," she said without particular complaint. They worked through the morning, and somewhere around midday, Clara said without looking up from the wire she was twisting, "My husband used to say a ranch ran on two things, water and stubbornness." "He was right," Ethan said. "He was right about a lot of things," she said. "He was wrong about a few others." The way she said it closed the subject not with anger, but with the particular finality of a woman who has processed something all the way through and has nothing left to add to it. Ethan didn't push. He understood the tone. He'd used it himself often enough about different things. They ate lunch on the porch, cold biscuits and dried beef and coffee which Clara produced from inside in under 3 minutes and set down without ceremony. Ethan ate and watched the land roll away toward the hills to the north, and felt again that feeling he couldn't name, that particular quiet that had nothing of emptiness in it. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Every winter," she said flatly. "Then spring comes, and I don't." He laughed. It came out before he could stop it. A real laugh, not the polite kind. Clara looked at him sideways with something close to amusement, and for a moment the reserve she wore like a second coat shifted just slightly. "What about you?" she said. "You ever think about stopping?" "Not until recently," he said. She looked at him. He looked out at the hills. Neither of them said anything else about it, and they went back to the fence, and he rode back to Silver Creek in the late afternoon with his muscles aching and something in his chest that he could not explain away as practicality. The week he'd promised Pete Garner turned into 2 weeks because Pete's recovery was slower than expected, and the stable had more business than one man could handle. And Ethan was already there, and already knew the horses, and already had the rhythm of the work. And the 2 weeks began to accumulate days at the edges. Tuesday evenings when Clara came into town, and they ended up talking outside the post office longer than either of them had planned Saturday mornings at the ranch, when he told himself he was just checking in on that back fence and found himself staying through dinner. He fixed a roof beam on her outbuilding that was bowing under the weight of the previous winter's snow damage. He helped her rotate the cattle to the east pasture when the grass on the west side needed rest. He split a season's worth of wood in a single afternoon because he had arrived to find her halfway through it and looking like she'd been at it since before sunrise. "You don't have to do all that," she said, watching him stack the last cord. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Ethan?" It was the first time she'd used his given name. He set down the axe and looked at her. "Don't do things for this place out of pity," she said. "I don't need pity. I've managed everything here without it." "I know you have," he said. "Then why are you still here?" The question was direct and real the way all her questions were. No performance in it, no fishing, just the thing she actually wanted to know. Ethan looked at his hands, then at her. "I don't fully know," he said. "That's the truth." Clara studied him for a long moment. "At least it's honest," she said, and went inside. He stood in the yard with the smell of fresh-cut wood and cold air around him, and thought about Wyoming, which he thought about less and less with each passing week, and found he could barely remember what specific plan had been waiting for him there. The twist that changed everything happened on a Friday evening, 3 weeks into what was supposed to have been a one-day stop. Ethan was at the saloon, not drinking heavily, just nursing a beer at the end of the workday, with Pete Garner, who was back on his feet enough to manage the mornings alone and had been generous enough to buy the first round. They were talking about nothing in particular when the man at the next table said Clara Bennett's name. Ethan didn't intend to listen. But the man's voice carried, and the name had acquired without his permission a quality that snagged his attention before he could redirect it. The man's name was Aldrich, Warren Aldrich. Ethan had seen him around Silver Creek without paying much attention, a prosperous-looking man, well-dressed for the territory, who seemed to conduct a significant amount of business out of the saloon rather than any particular office. He was talking to 2 other men, and what he was saying was this: "She'll have to sell eventually. She's carrying too much debt. Her late husband borrowed against the property, not common knowledge, but I have the documentation. She's got maybe 1 more season before the bank calls it." One of the other men said something Ethan couldn't hear. "I've made her 2 fair offers," Aldrich said. "She's being stubborn, but stubborn doesn't feed cattle through winter. Another hard season and she'll have no choice." Ethan set down his beer. Pete Garner, who had heard the same thing, leaned across the table and said quietly, "That man has been trying to get Clara's land for 2 years. Her husband borrowed money before he died, not much, but Aldrich bought the note from the original lender. Technically, she owes him." "How much?" Ethan said. Pete shook his head. "Enough that it's trouble, not enough that it's impossible. But Aldrich has been letting the interest compound, and then showing up with lowball offers every few months, acting like he's doing her a favor." Ethan looked at Aldrich across the room. Aldrich was smiling at something one of his companions had said, the relaxed smile of a man who believes he is the only one with a clear view of the future. "Does she know you know about this?" Ethan asked Pete. "Clara knows I know," Pete said. "She told me herself about a year ago, said she was handling it. I believe she is as best she can. But best she can and good enough might not be the same thing this winter." Ethan finished his beer and left without explanation. He walked out into the cold night air and stood on the street for a minute, looking north toward the road that ran out of town, toward the Bennett Ranch, thinking with the particular clarity that comes when something that has been vague suddenly has edges and weight. He was not her husband. He was not her business partner. He was barely a person she knew. He went back to the boarding house and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, he rode to the ranch early before she was expecting him and found her already at the barn. She looked at him when he came through the door and said without preamble, "You heard something." It wasn't a question. She read people the way she read horses, quickly and accurately. "Pete told me about the note," he said. "And I heard Aldrich talking in the saloon last night." Clara's jaw tightened. It was the first crack in the composed exterior he'd seen since he'd known her, small as a hairline fracture, but real. "What did he say?" Ethan told her exactly and without softening it. She deserved the straight version. She was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on Soldier's stall door. Then she said very evenly, "He's not wrong about the debt. He's wrong about everything else." "What do you mean?" "The note comes due in February," she said. "I have been saving since August. I will have enough. Not by much, but enough." She paused. "What Aldrich doesn't know, what he's been assuming, instead of finding out, is that my husband's brother in Cheyenne sent money 2 months ago. An inheritance from their mother's estate that was tied up in probate. It cleared in September." She looked at Ethan directly. "I haven't told anyone because it's no one's business. But I'm not as exposed as he thinks I am." Ethan felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized was wound tight. "Then you're going to be all right." "I have been all right," she said with a firmness that wasn't unkind but was very clear. "I have been all right for 2 years alone without anyone knowing the details of my finances or my problems. I don't need rescuing, Ethan." "I know," he said. "Do you?" The air between them had a different quality now. Not hostile, not cold, but charged in the way air charges before weather moves in, full of something that hadn't arrived yet but was on its way. "I wasn't trying to ride in and fix anything," he said carefully. "I heard something that concerned me, and I came to tell you. That's all." "Why?" she said, not harshly, genuinely. "Because I—" He stopped, started again. "Because I care what happens here." Clara looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming in through the barn door, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, and somewhere outside, a crow was making noise about something. Finally she said, "You care what happens here?" "Yes," he said. "Is that all you're going to say about that?" "For now," he said. She studied him the way she'd studied that horseshoe the first morning, carefully, thoroughly, without rushing. Then she picked up her gloves from the stall door and put them on. "All right," she said. "I need the east fence checked before it snows. You can help or you can go back to town. Your choice." He picked up a pair of work gloves from the hook beside the door. "I'll stay," he said. The word landed in the air between them and settled there, and neither of them said anything further about it, but they both heard it, and they both understood that it meant something larger than fence work. And the morning moved forward, the way mornings do with work and cold air, and the particular closeness that builds between people who choose to be in the same difficult place at the same difficult time. Not because they have to be, but because something in them has quietly, stubbornly, irrevocably decided. By the time they came in from the fence line that afternoon, Ethan had stopped thinking about Wyoming altogether. He wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, only that it had. The snow came in November without warning, the way it always did in Montana. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, as if the sky had been holding its breath since September, and finally gave out. Ethan was at the ranch when it started splitting the last of a cord of wood he'd been working through in pieces over the past 2 weeks. He heard it before he felt it, a change in the silence, the particular hush that precedes weather. And then the first flakes came sideways off the northern hills, and within 20 minutes, the yard was white. Clara appeared in the barn doorway and looked at the sky with the expression of someone calculating. "You're not making it back to town tonight," she said. "I know," he said. "Spare room is made up," she said. "It was my father's." She said it the way she said most things, directly, without excess meaning attached. An offer of shelter, not an invitation to anything further. Ethan understood the distinction and respected it. "Thank you," he said, and stacked the last of the wood. That was the first night he stayed at the Bennett Ranch. He slept in the spare room, which smelled of old cedar and pipe tobacco, and the particular stillness of a space that had been kept clean out of respect rather than use. He lay in the dark and listened to the snow against the window and the occasional shift of cattle in the barn, and thought about the fact that he had not slept this soundly in 11 years. He was asleep before he finished the thought. In the morning, Clara had coffee on before he was fully dressed, and they ate breakfast without much talking, the snow still coming down hard outside, and it was the most natural thing in the world. And also beneath that something else entirely, something that neither of them had named, and both of them knew was there. "You don't have to stay," she said over her second cup. "Where would I go?" he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "but it's honest." She looked at him across the table. "Ethan, I need to ask you something and I need a straight answer." He set down his cup. "All right." "Why are you still in Silver Creek?" she said. "Pete is back on his feet. You don't have any work here that's yours. You could have been in Wyoming 6 weeks ago. So I'm asking you straight, what are you doing here?" The question sat between them on the table like something solid. He had been expecting it for weeks. He had rehearsed answers in the boarding house, running through reasonable explanations. The horse needed more rest. The weather was getting bad. He was saving money for the trip. All of them were partially true. None of them were the real answer. "I don't want to leave," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same as wanting to stay," she said. He looked at her. "I know the difference," he said. "I want to stay." She stood up and carried her cup to the stove. She stood there with her back to him, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight stiffness of someone managing something they hadn't decided yet how to handle. "My husband was a good man," she said without turning around. "He loved this land. He loved me. But he always had one eye on the horizon. There was always somewhere he was going to go, something he was going to do once things were settled. Things were never settled enough." She paused. "He died before he ever stopped moving, Ethan. And I buried him, and I grieved him, and I kept this ranch going, and I swore to myself I would never again give my heart to a man who had one foot out the door." Ethan stood up slowly. He walked to where she was standing and stopped a few feet behind her. "Clara." She turned around. "I threw away the last thing I was moving toward," he said quietly. "I don't have a plan for Wyoming. I don't have a plan for anywhere. What I have is this: every morning I wake up in that boarding house room, and the first thing I think about is whether there's something useful I can do here, on this ranch, in this town, near you." He stopped. "I don't know how to say it better than that." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes doing that thing they did, reading, measuring, not rushing. "You're going to have to give me time," she finally said. "I've got time," he said. That was the morning everything shifted quietly and without ceremony. The way real things shift, not in a dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of a decision that had already been made and was only now being acknowledged. But the world outside the Bennett Ranch did not pause to accommodate the careful progress of two people learning to trust each other. Warren Aldrich made his third offer the following week. Ethan was in the dry goods store when he saw Aldrich's buggy pull up outside the Bennett Ranch. He knew the vehicle by now, had seen it enough times to recognize the particular way Aldrich drove, upright and proprietorial, as though the road belonged to him too. He watched from across the street and felt the old familiar tension rise in his jaw. He didn't ride out. It was not his place. Clara had made that clear, and she was right. He heard about it that evening because Clara told him herself when he came by after supper to check on a heifer that had been off her feed. "He came today," she said without bothering to specify who. "I saw his buggy," Ethan said. "He raised his offer." Her voice was level. "Considerably." Ethan watched her face. And I told him the same thing I told him twice before," she said. "No. He accept that." Clara's expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "He said something different this time," she said. "He said he had spoken to the bank in Billings, that the loan officer had agreed to accelerate the note. He's claiming he can call the full debt in January instead of February." Ethan straightened. "Can he do that?" "The original terms don't allow it," she said, "but Aldrich is claiming there's a clause in the fine print. I haven't seen the full document in 2 years. I don't know if he's bluffing or if there's something I missed." "Where's the document?" "Land office," she said. "Filed with the deed." "Then you need to read it," Ethan said. "Tonight, first thing tomorrow, before Aldrich does anything else." "I know that," she said, with the slight edge of someone being told what they've already figured out. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry," she said. Just come with me to the land office tomorrow." He was there at 7 in the morning before the land office opened, standing on the boardwalk in the cold. Clara arrived 3 minutes later with her coat buttoned to the throat and a set look on her face that he was beginning to recognize the expression she wore when she had made up her mind about something and was now in the business of executing it. The land clerk, a young man named Morris, who wore spectacles and clearly found the whole situation deeply uncomfortable, retrieved the filed loan documentation after 10 minutes of searching. Clara sat at the small reading table in the corner of the office and went through the document page by page while Ethan stood beside her and read over her shoulder. She found the clause on page 4. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and said very quietly, "He modified it." Morris looked up from his desk. "This document," Clara said in a voice that had gone dangerously even, "was not filed in this condition. There is a clause here, Clause 7 subsection B, that was not in the original agreement my husband signed. I read that agreement. I have a copy at the ranch. This language was not in it." Morris came around his desk with visible reluctance and looked at the page she was pointing to. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the ink. He looked at the surrounding text. His face went slightly pale. "Mrs. Bennet," he said carefully, I would need to compare this against the original filing record." "Then do that," she said. "Right now." It took Morris 20 minutes to locate the original filing copy, which was kept in a separate sealed ledger. When he laid the two documents side by side on the table, the difference was immediately visible to anyone who looked. The ink in Clause 7 subsection B of the filed copy was slightly different in shade from the surrounding text. The handwriting of the inserted clause was not identical to the handwriting in the rest of the document. And most damningly, the original filing copy contained no Clause 7 subsection B at all. The line of text that Aldrich was using to threaten accelerated collection had been added to the filed copy after the original was submitted. Morris sat down heavily in his chair. This is a serious matter, Mrs. Bennet." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at Ethan. Ethan was already thinking it through. "He had access to the filed copy," he said. "That means someone in this office, or someone who knew how to gain access after hours," Clara said. Morris looked like he was going to be sick. "Mr. Morris," Clara said, turning to him with the steady calm of someone who has the high ground and knows it. "I need you to sign a statement attesting to what we have just observed, the discrepancy between the filed copy and the original record. I need it notarized, and I need a copy of both documents to take with me." "Mrs. Bennet, this could implicate." "I know what it implicates," she said. "I also know that if you don't document this properly, you become part of the problem. And I don't think you want that." Morris looked at her for a long moment. He was a young man who had probably imagined a quiet career of filing papers and recording transactions. He had not imagined this. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't want that." He prepared the statement. He had it notarized by the justice of the peace 2 doors down, who read the documentation with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. By 10 in the morning, Clara Bennet walked out of the land office with a signed, notarized statement, documenting a fraudulent alteration of filed loan documents, copies of both versions of the contract, and the knowledge that Warren Aldrich had committed a crime serious enough to render his claim legally worthless and his reputation in the territory finished. She stood on the boardwalk and breathed the cold air. Ethan stood beside her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go to Sheriff Daly," she said. "Today, before Aldrich hears about this. And after that," she looked down at the documents in her hand, then up at him. For a moment something moved across her face that wasn't anger, wasn't calculation, wasn't the composed practicality she wore like armor. It was relief. The deep, bone-level relief of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just for the first time put it down. After that, she said, "I'm going home." Sheriff Daly was a man of few words and efficient action, which were exactly the qualities the situation required. He read the documents, asked Clara 3 precise questions, asked Morris 2 more, over the telephone line to the land office, and had a deputy ride out to Aldrich's property before noon. Aldrich was in the sheriff's office by 2 o'clock. Ethan was not in the room for that conversation. Clara was. She sat across from Warren Aldrich with the notarized statement on the table between them and did not raise her voice once. Ethan waited outside on the bench in the hallway and listened to the silence from within the closed office, which was the particular silence of a man realizing he had miscalculated something fundamental. When Clara came out 40 minutes later, she was carrying all her documents and her face was composed and her hands were completely steady. "Well," Ethan said. "He is withdrawing all claims against the property," she said. "In writing, signed in front of Sheriff Daly and 2 witnesses. His attorney will file the formal release of the note by end of week, or Daly files criminal charges for document fraud." She paused. His attorney advised him strongly to cooperate. Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said, but her voice had lost its edge entirely. She was very close to something she had not been close to in a long time, something that had nothing to do with strength or competence, or holding the ranch together alone. "You did that," he said. "All of it. You found it, and you proved it, and you walked in there, and you finished it." "I know," she said, but her voice was quieter now. "And you've been carrying that threat for 2 years, he said, alone." She looked away down the hallway. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "You do now," he said. The words fell between them and stayed there. Clara turned back to look at him, and for the first time in all the weeks he'd known her, she looked her age not old, not beaten, but real. The way people look when they've stopped performing and let themselves be seen. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears, and everything to do with the release of something held too long under too much pressure. "I'm tired, Ethan," she said. Not a complaint, just a fact offered plainly. "I know," he said. "I'm tired of managing everything alone," she said. "I'm tired of calculating how much I can afford to feel and still keep the ranch running. I'm tired of being strong because there's no alternative." "There's an alternative now," he said, "if you want it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do in all the weeks he'd known her. She reached out and took his hand. Just that. No declaration. No words. Just her hand in his for a moment in the hallway outside the sheriff's office in the little town of Silver Creek, Montana, on a cold November afternoon, while the first real winter of the season pressed down on everything outside. Ethan held her hand and didn't say a word and didn't move. And in that silence, something was decided between them that neither of them would need to say out loud for quite some time, because some agreements between people don't need language. They just need the willingness of both people to stay exactly where they are and not let go. They didn't talk about what it meant on the ride back to the ranch. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed quality. It was no longer the careful silence of 2 people keeping appropriate distance. It was the quieter, warmer silence of people who have stopped pretending they don't know what's happening. Ethan stayed for supper. He stayed the following day to check the cattle in the east pasture. He came back the day after that because there was a section of barn roof that had taken on too much snow weight and needed reinforcing before it became a real problem. These were all true reasons, and also, at this point, transparent ones. He was not sure when the pretense of practicality had become unnecessary, only that it had, and that neither of them was going through the motions of it anymore. What they were doing instead was harder to name and considerably harder to navigate. The first real argument happened on a Thursday, 10 days after the land office, and it came from nowhere, the way real arguments always do, not from the thing they were arguing about, but from everything underneath it. Clara had ridden into town alone to speak with Morris at the land office about the final filing of Aldrich's withdrawal. She had told Ethan she was going. She had not asked him to come. When she got back to the ranch in the early afternoon, he was there in the yard, and the look on his face told her he'd been watching the road for longer than he wanted to admit. "You're back," he said. "I told you I would be," she said, dismounting. "You could have let me come with you." She looked at him over her horse's back. "I didn't need you to come with me." "I know you didn't need me to," he said. "That's not what I said." She handed off the reins and turned to face him fully. "Ethan, I have been riding into town alone for 2 years. I conducted that entire business today in under an hour. Everything is in order." "What exactly is the problem?" "The problem," he said, and then stopped because he was discovering in real time that the problem was difficult to articulate without sounding like something he did not want to sound like. "Say it," she said. "I wanted to be there," he said. "In case something went wrong." "Nothing went wrong." "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it 2 hours ago." Clara studied him. He could see her working through it, the way she worked through everything methodically, honestly. "You were worried," she said. "Yes." "About me?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not used to someone worrying about me," she said. The edge in her voice had softened. "My husband worried about the ranch, about the cattle, about the price of beef in Billings. He wasn't the kind of man who noticed when I was the one who needed something." Ethan looked at her. "I noticed," he said simply. The argument, such as it was, ended there. Not with resolution exactly, but with the particular mutual recognition that they were both learning the same difficult thing from different directions. She was learning to let someone in, and he was learning that caring about someone meant accepting they were capable of taking care of themselves. It was not a lesson either of them mastered quickly, but they were trying, and trying counted for something. December came in hard, and the ranch work multiplied with the cold. Ethan had quietly stopped paying rent at Mrs. Hale's boarding house 3 weeks into December, not because he had formally moved to the ranch, he had not, and they had not discussed it, but because he was there every day, from before sunrise to after dark, and the ride back to town in the dark, and the cold, and back again before light was a waste of time and energy that neither of them had to spare. He slept in the spare room, the room that had been her father's. There was nothing improper about the arrangement, and the town of Silver Creek, for the most part, minded its own business about it. Pete Garner didn't say a word. Mrs. Hale, when Ethan settled his final week's account, gave him a look of such transparent approval that he felt his face go warm for the first time in years. "You're a good man, Mr. Walker," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. The twist that Ethan had not anticipated came from the direction he least expected his own past. It arrived in the form of a letter postmarked from Denver, Colorado, delivered to the Silver Creek post office in the 3rd week of December and waiting for him when Clara sent him in for supplies. He almost didn't open it. The handwriting on the envelope was not familiar, and he'd learned over the years that letters from strangers rarely delivered good news. He opened it standing outside the post office in the cold. It was from a lawyer. A man named Cartwright, representing the estate of one Daniel Marcus Hale. No relation to the boarding house, Mrs. Hale, a cattle broker from Colorado, who had died in October without living heirs. The letter informed Ethan that he had been named in the will as a beneficiary. A partial share of a small cattle operation outside Denver, valued by the estate at approximately $400, was being held in his name pending his response. Ethan read the letter twice. He had known Daniel Hale exactly once 12 years ago. A kind man who had given a 19-year-old drifter from Texas 3 days of work and a decent meal, and on the last day, a piece of advice that Ethan had carried with him ever since: find something worth stopping for before you run out of road. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and stood there for a minute. $400 was not a fortune, but it was enough to buy a stake in something, enough to build on. He rode back to the ranch and told Clara about it that evening over supper, putting the letter on the table between them. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him across the table. "What are you going to do?" "I want to write back and accept the share," he said. "And then I want to liquidate it, sell my portion back to the estate at whatever fair value they assess. And I want to put that money into this ranch." The silence that followed was of a very particular kind. "No," Clara said. "Clara, no," she said again more firmly. "I am not taking your money. It's not..." He stopped, started over. I'm not offering it as charity. I'm not offering it as a loan. I'm offering it as a man who intends to be part of this place, asking to invest in it. She looked at him steadily. And what exactly does part of this place mean to you, Ethan Walker? He held her gaze. You know what it means. I want to hear you say it. He had been a man who did not stay. He had been a man who kept his feelings at the same distance. He kept his belongings light portable. Nothing that couldn't be left behind when the time came. He had told himself that was wisdom. He had told himself that was self-preservation. Sitting at Clara Bennett's kitchen table in December of 1887, he understood finally that it was neither. It was fear. Plain, ordinary fear dressed up as freedom. I want to marry you, he said. If you'll have me. Clara did not say anything for a long moment. That is a significant thing to say, she said. I know it is. You've been here 2 months. I know that too. People will say it's too fast. Probably, he said. I don't much care what people say. She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. I buried my husband on this land, she said quietly. I grieved him longer than most people know. Not just because I lost him, because I spent the last years of our marriage waiting for him to stop looking past me at whatever was coming next. And when he died, I realized he never did stop. She paused. I swore I wouldn't do that again. I swore I would not put my life in the hands of a man whose nature was to leave. I know, Ethan said. And then you showed up, she said with the ghost of something that was almost exasperation and almost tenderness. With a lame horse and 11 years of leaving behind you. I know, he said again. So you understand why I need more than 2 months, she said. Yes, he said. How much time do you need? She looked at him for a long time. Ask me again in spring, she said. If you're still here in spring, you can ask me again. It was not yes. It was also unmistakably not no. And coming from Clara Bennett, who did not say things she didn't mean and did not offer things she wasn't prepared to give, it was the most honest answer he could have received. All right, he said. Spring. She pushed back her chair and stood up. She picked up the letter from the table and handed it back to him. Write to the lawyer, she said. Accept the share. Keep the money. If you're going to be a rancher, you'll need it. She paused at the doorway. And Ethan. He looked up. Don't ask me in spring if you're not certain, she said. I'll say no to a man who's not certain, no matter how long he's been here. I'm certain, he said. I know you think you are, she said. I want you to be sure. She went to bed. He sat at the table alone with the letter in his hand and the lamp burning low, and thought about the difference between thinking you were certain and being sure, whether there was a difference, or whether certainty and sureness were the same thing arrived at by different roads. He decided they were the same. He was sure. January was brutal, and the ranch demanded everything both of them had. A pipe froze and burst in the second week, and they spent a full day and a half in the cold managing the damage. 3 cattle came down sick from the same contaminated water source. A problem Clara identified faster than the neighboring ranchers, identified their own losses because she knew her animals and she paid attention. The feed stored in the outer barn was running low enough that they had to make careful calculations every morning about rationing. None of it was romantic. All of it was real. And what Ethan discovered in those hard January weeks was the thing he had not been able to understand from the outside. From 11 years of looking at other people's settled lives and seeing only their stillness. He had not understood that staying was not passive. Staying was active. It required something of a person every single day, a continuous choice made in the cold and the difficulty and the exhaustion, and the choice was not to leave. He made that choice every morning in January when the cold woke him before sunrise. He made it every evening when the work was done and there was nothing glamorous about any of it. He made it in the middle of a night in late January when a heifer went into difficult labor, and he and Clara worked side by side in the barn for 4 cold hours, and the calf made it, and Clara sat back against the barn wall with her hands on her knees and her eyes closed for a moment. And Ethan sat beside her shoulder to shoulder, not talking just there. That was when he understood that he had not only stopped running, he had arrived. "You all right?" he said. "Tired," she said, eyes still closed. "Good tired." "Good tired," he agreed. She opened her eyes and looked sideways at him. They were closer than they had been before in the way exhaustion collapses the distance people maintain between themselves. He could see the lines at the corners of her eyes, the particular way her jaw set when she was tired, the strand of hair that had come loose and was hanging across her cheek. She reached up and tucked the hair back without looking at herself. "You should get some sleep," she said. "So should you," he said. "In a minute," she said. "I want to make sure the calf is steady first." He didn't go. He stayed beside her, and she didn't tell him again to leave, and they sat together in the warmth of the barn, while the calf found its legs, and the mother settled, and the night outside pressed cold and quiet against the walls. After a while, Clara said, without any particular lead-in, "My husband's name was James." Ethan waited. "He was 24 when we married," she said. "I was 22. I thought restlessness was exciting when I was 22. I thought it meant he was ambitious." She paused. "It just meant he was restless." "Did he love you?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "In his way. He loved the idea of what was coming next more than he loved what was already here." She looked at the calf. "I spent 8 years trying to be interesting enough to be what he was looking for." "Clara," Ethan said. "Don't," she said, but gently. "I'm not saying it for sympathy. I'm saying it so you understand something." She turned and looked at him directly. "When you look at me, Ethan, what do you see?" He didn't look away. "I see the most capable person I have ever met," he said. "I see someone who built a life out of loss and kept it running through sheer force of honesty and hard work. I see someone who makes me want to be worth something." He paused. "I see the place I want to come home to." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she stood up, brushed off her coat, and said, "The calf is steady. Go to bed." But when she walked past him to check the latch on the barn door, she let her hand rest briefly on his shoulder, a gesture so brief it barely happened, and also entirely deliberate, and he understood exactly what it meant. Spring was not yet a promise, but it was coming, and they both knew now that they were going to meet it together. February passed. The way hard months do slowly at the front end, and then all at once, as if time itself got tired of the cold and decided to be done with it. The debt note came due on the 14th of the month. Clara paid it in full in person at the bank in Billings, with Ethan driving the wagon. She carried the payment in a sealed envelope in her coat pocket, and she walked into that bank the way she walked into every difficult situation, straight-backed, clear-eyed, without performance. She came out 12 minutes later with a stamped receipt and the original note marked "Satisfied" in red ink. She stood on the boardwalk outside the bank and looked at the document in her hand for a long moment. "It's done," Ethan said. "It's done," she said. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket and looked up at him. Something in her face had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, to anyone who didn't know her. But Ethan knew her, and what he saw was the release of the last weight she had been carrying alone. The debt was gone. Aldrich was finished. The ranch was hers, clear and free on no one else's terms. She had done it. Not with his money, not with anyone's rescue. She had done it with 2 years of relentless, unglamorous, unwitnessed work and the intelligence to catch a fraudster at his own game, and the stubbornness to hold on when holding on was the hardest possible thing. On the drive back to Silver Creek, she sat beside him on the wagon bench with her shoulder against his, and didn't say much, and he didn't either. And the silence between them was the warmest thing he had felt since Texas a long time ago, when he was young enough to still believe that warmth was something you could count on staying. March came, and the snow began giving back the ground it had taken in November. The cattle that had made it through the winter were thin but standing. The calf from January, the difficult birth in the cold barn, was growing fast and loud, and followed Clara around the yard with the devotion of an animal that somehow understood who had stayed up all night for it. Clara named it Persistent. "That's not a cattle name," Ethan said. "It is now," she said. The days got longer. The mud came, which meant the real work of spring was beginning. The kind of work that is endless and physical and deeply ordinary. And also, when you are doing it beside the right person, something else entirely. They worked the fence lines together, turned the soil in the kitchen garden, moved the cattle to the spring pasture, and checked every animal for the damage winter had done. One evening in the last week of March, with the light staying past 6 o'clock for the first time since October, Ethan came in from the barn to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table with the photograph from the wall in front of her. Her wedding photograph, the one with young Clara and the broad grinning James, who always had one eye on the horizon. She heard him come in and didn't look up immediately. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She looked up. "I was thinking about something you said, back in January, in the barn." She paused. "You said you see the place you want to come home to." "I meant it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That's what I was thinking about." She set the photograph face down on the table, not with anger, with the deliberate finality of someone putting something in its proper place in the past where it belonged. "I spent 8 years waiting for a man to come home to me," she said. "And I spent 2 years after that telling myself I didn't need anyone to come home to, that I was enough for myself." She looked at him. "I was right about the second part, but I was using it to hide from something." "What?" he said. "That it's better," she said simply. "With someone. The right someone. It's just better." Ethan crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. He looked at her across the table, this woman who had shoed his horse and fed him breakfast, and kept a ranch alive through grief and debt and fraud, and 2 Montana winters. This woman who had been strong in every way a person could be strong, and still had the courage to say plainly that she didn't want to be alone. "Spring," he said. She looked at him. "You told me to ask again in spring," he said. "If I was still here." He held her gaze. "I'm still here. I'm certain. I'm sure both things, whatever the difference is. I want to marry you, Clara. I want to build the rest of my life on this land with you. I want to be the man who comes home." He paused. "Is that enough?" She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the evening was settling in soft and cool, and somewhere across the pasture a meadowlark was doing the thing meadowlarks do in spring, declaring itself loudly and without apology to anyone within range. "Yes," she said. "That's enough." He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. They were married in the first week of May in the small white church on Silver Creek's main street, in a ceremony that was brief and honest and attended by Pete Garner and his wife, Mrs. Hale Morris, from the land office, who had turned out in the aftermath of the Aldrich matter to be a decent young man, in a situation that had briefly gotten away from him, and a scattering of townspeople who had watched Ethan Walker go from passing stranger to permanent fixture with the quiet approval of a community that recognized a man who had finally stopped running and started belonging. Clara wore a dress she had made herself a deep blue that Ethan had never seen on her before, and she walked into the church the same way she walked everywhere, with purpose and without ceremony, and stood beside him at the front, and said her vows in a voice that did not waver once. Ethan's voice wavered. He hadn't expected it. It came from somewhere below the careful composure he'd built over 11 years, from something that the years of moving had buried deep enough that he'd thought it was gone. When he said the words to have and to hold, for better or worse, to love and to cherish, they came out rough and real, and Clara looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to tenderness he had ever seen on her face, and he thought that if he had any debt to the universe for the accumulated waste of his wandering years, he was going to spend the rest of his life paying it back right here. The years that followed were not easy. Easy was not something the territory offered, and neither Ethan nor Clara had ever expected it. The ranch demanded everything they had in good years, and more than everything in bad ones. There was a drought in 1890 that killed half the cattle in the county, and left them eating careful through 2 winters. There was a year when the roof of the main barn gave in under record snowfall, and they rebuilt it themselves, board by board, with Pete Garner and two neighbors who showed up without being asked. There was a year when Clara was sick for 6 weeks in the fall, and Ethan ran the ranch alone and understood for the first time completely, and without abstraction, what she had carried by herself for 2 years. He never made light of it again in thought or word. They had 3 children, a boy they named Thomas for Clara's father, a girl they named Ruth for nobody in particular, just a name Clara said felt right when she held her, and a second boy born in the summer of 1893 who came into the world with Ethan's dark eyes and Clara's absolute determination and spent most of his childhood following his mother around the ranch like a shadow with opinions. They named him James. Ethan had expected Clara might resist the name given everything. She didn't. She said simply that a name was just a name, and that the man she was raising would make his own meaning out of it. She was right. He did. The boy grew up with his mother's practicality and his father's capacity for stillness, and became in time exactly the kind of young man that both of them were proud of without entirely understanding how they'd managed it. The town grew around them. Silver Creek was no longer quite the quiet 200-person settlement it had been in 1887. The railroad pushed through in 1892 and brought commerce and newcomers and a kind of change that Ethan watched with the particular mixture of acceptance and wariness of a man who had seen enough territory transform to know that the land outlasted everything people did to it. The Bennett Walker Ranch survived and adapted and grew not dramatically, but steadily, the way things grow when they are properly rooted. Warren Aldrich left the territory in the spring of 1888 and was not spoken of much after that. The rumor was that he had similar operations in 2 other counties, and that Silver Creek had merely been the one that caught him. The rumor also was that his legal troubles followed him east and that he did not prosper. Ethan did not spend much time thinking about Warren Aldrich. He had more interesting things to think about. It was on a September evening in 1906. 19 years after a horse threw a shoe on a cold October road, that Ethan Walker sat on the porch of the ranch house he had helped build and extended and repair across 2 decades, watching his grown children move about the yard in the last light of the day. Thomas was 20 years old and had his mother's way with animals and his father's capacity for patience, which in a young man of 20 was unusual enough that people noticed it. Ruth was 17 and already running half the household, with a quiet competence that made Ethan think every time he watched her of the woman who had come out of a barn with a bucket and a leather strap and looked at him without flinching. James was 13 and still had opinions about everything, and was usually right enough that arguing with him was more trouble than it was worth. Soldier was gone. He had died in the winter of 1899, full of age and dignity, and Ethan had buried him on the north side of the property near the fence line they had repaired together on that first Saturday. He had not replaced him with another horse of the same name. Some things did not need replacing. Clara came out of the house and sat down beside him in the other porch chair, the chair that had been hers for 19 years, the one positioned exactly where she could see both the barn and the front gate without turning her head. For a while they sat without talking the way they did most evenings. The silence between them full of the particular richness of 2 people who have said everything that matters over a long time and no longer need to say most of it out loud. Then Clara said, "Do you remember what you told me that first morning in the kitchen?" He thought about it. "I told you a lot of things that morning." "You said you didn't know why you stayed for breakfast," she said. "I remember." "Do you know now?" she said. He looked at the gate. The same gate he had pushed open 19 years ago with a lame horse and 11 years of running behind him. It was newer wood now. He had replaced it himself 8 years ago, but it hung in the same place, and it still swung in the wind the same way, and every time he looked at it, he saw himself standing there, with Soldier calculating the distance to Silver Creek, telling himself the stop was temporary. "Yeah," he said. "I know now." Clara reached over and took his hand, the same way she had on the day they drove back from Billings, with the paid note in her pocket, the same way she had in the hallway outside the sheriff's office, the same way she had been doing for 19 years, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who had decided once to trust someone and had not regretted it. "What do you know?" she said. He thought about the answer. He thought about the 19 years of mornings and arguments and difficult winters and the calf named Persistent, and the photograph she had laid face down on the table in March of 1888. He thought about the barn in January, and the land office, and the sheriff's office hallway, and the church in May. He thought about 3 children growing up on land that was theirs. He thought about the man he had been in October of 1887, hollow and fast, and going nowhere with great dedication. That a horseshoe is a small thing, he said, and small things decide everything. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Funny how small things decide a whole life." It was almost exactly what she had said to him once before years ago in a version of this same conversation, and he recognized it the way you recognize the best lines because they were true the first time and they were still true, and they would be true long after the person saying them was gone. He held her hand and watched his children in the evening light and felt in the whole of his body and the whole of his life the thing he had ridden 11 years and 10,000 miles to find without knowing what he was looking for. He had ridden through drought and blizzard and empty territory, and the particular loneliness of a man who has convinced himself that movement is the same as living. He had ridden past 100 towns and 1,000 ranches, and more open sky than a person could ever fully account for. He had ridden all of it, and arrived finally here on a porch in Montana with a woman who had shoed his horse and fed him breakfast and refused to be rescued and taught him by example what it looked like to stand in one place and make it mean something. He had not found belonging at the end of a long road. He had found it the moment he stopped riding. And the man who had spent 11 years certain that the next territory would be the one worth stopping for, understood on that September evening with his wife's hand in his and his children's voices carrying across the yard that he had not been searching for a place at all. He had been searching for this, for the courage to stay for a woman strong enough to let him for a life built not on the promise of what was coming next, but on the hard, honest, irreplaceable value of what was already here. He had almost missed it. 1 shoe. 1 mile more, and he would have ridden straight past the gate, past the barn, past the woman with the bucket and the gloves, and the voice that told him facts instead of stories. He would have ridden into Wyoming and found nothing, because nothing was what he had been pointing toward. Instead, Soldier's left foreleg had hit a frost-heaved rock at precisely the right moment, on precisely the right stretch of road, and Ethan Walker had pushed open a stranger's gate, and a widow named Clara Bennett had walked out of her barn and told him she could fix what was broken. She had been right about the horseshoe. She had been right about everything else, too. That was the whole of it. The truth that took him half a lifetime to earn, and 1 October morning to stumble into. Not every man who stops is lost, and not every man who is lost knows enough to stop. Ethan Walker had been both at the same time on the same cold morning, and the difference between the life he'd had and the life he got came down to 1 thrown shoe and 1 open gate, and 1 woman who looked at a drifter's lame horse and saw something worth fixing. He had never once in 19 years taken a single day of it for granted. And sitting there on that porch, holding Clara's hand in the last light of a September evening, watching the life they had built move quietly through the yard, Ethan Walker was certain completely permanently, without the shadow of a doubt, that he had ended up in the only place he was ever meant to be.